Hello and welcome to a Firstpost POV. Australia is in a state of shock and disbelief over what happened over the weekend. 15 people were killed by a father-son duo in what's been described as a terror incident. The motive, as of now, is believed to be an anti-Jewish propaganda. This is basically an anti-Semitic attack, is the assumption right now. And it's also triggered a diplomatic standoff between Israel and Australia, with the Israeli Prime Minister basically accusing the Australian Prime Minister of fanning the flames of anti-Semitism, because of which this attack happened. The question is, what was the exact motive and how does Australia plan to deal with these sort of security incidents going forward? Joining me now to discuss that is Dr Josh Roose, who's an Associate Professor of Politics at Deakin University, and he specializes in political and religious violent extremism and terrorism. Thank you so much, Professor, for speaking to us on Firstpost.
Good afternoon.
Let's talk about the anti-Semitism motive right now. Australia recorded some 1,600 cases of anti-Semitism this year so far. So a lot of Jewish groups and a lot of Jewish leaders are saying that this was always around the corner, that an attack of this sort was always inevitable. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do. This was unfortunately entirely predictable. In the aftermath of October 7, we saw Islamist groups in the streets of Sydney, in front of the Opera House, screaming very explicit slogans about F the Jews, gas the Jews. And that was never dealt with adequately from day one. So in the aftermath of that, we've seen a number of anti-Semitic incidents, including, but not limited to, threats, harassment, arson, attacks, physical attacks. And it's gotten to a boiling over point where the Jewish community were basically saying for quite a prolonged period of time, they were seriously concerned about their safety. In one incident, this was identified as being linked to Iran, the Iranian government, or Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and the Iranian ambassador was expelled. However, there are many more incidents that have come from both Islamists but also far-left activists.
Right. Let's talk about the specifics a bit and the fact that this was carried out by a father and son. How rare is that in the cases that you've studied, and what does it tell us about perhaps the way in which this entire operation or this conspiracy was plotted? Do you think this was plotted at home? Do you think there was perhaps foreign angle at play? What does it tell us about it?
The father-son involvement is unusual. Family involvement, certainly not. There are many incidents where families have been radicalised and fought together. In the context of how this may have played out, it appears that the weapons were stockpiled, that they would have conducted hostile reconnaissance. There's been reporting, and I'm not privy to the specific detail, that the individual concerned, the son, the 24-year-old, had been involved with radicalised young Muslims from Western Sydney as long ago as 6 to 7 years, and that there was an investigation of him and his family, and that was linked again based on reporting to Islamic State. However, that seemed to blow over. He was then free to continue that trajectory along with his father and to basically carry out the worst terror attack in Australian history.
I want to dwell on that point that you mentioned, which is that the son, one of the shooters in this question, was examined by Australian authorities back in 2019, and they deemed it was fine for him to move on. Does that signify some sort of a security or intelligence failure on the part of the Australian authorities? And is it rare for an individual to be under their radar and then to be just let go and continue to do what he was practicing before, which in this case was linked to the ISIS?
I think, to be fair, Australia's intelligence agencies are very good and very thorough. It speaks to the scale of the problem and the challenge. We're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of potential targets that they've got to pay attention to. Not only in Muslim communities, in the extreme right, we have a burgeoning neo-Nazi movement again here in Australia. So there are many. It's incredibly resource intensive, and there are many cases of which they've got to not only conduct an assessment, but determine who they're going to focus on. In that particular period of time, there are many more outspoken and aggressive actors that they've been paying attention to. He was in the orbit, from what I understand, but he wasn't a key player. And to that extent, obviously, ideally, he would have been picked up and understood, but he may well have radicalised even further in the context of the pandemic and post-pandemic.
Right. In this case, there seems to be a lot of reporting that suggests that the Islamic State had perhaps some sort of a role to play, at least in radicalizing these two shooters. Can you give us a sense of how big the ISIS problem is in Australia? Is it limited to social media groups or ideological campaigns, or do you have sleeper cells and agents who are basically plotting these and they are on the intelligence agencies' radars? How big is the problem in Australia?
It's a significant challenge. I mean, the Islamic State were militarily defeated back in 2017-18. And it's, if anything, it's the ideology and it's the sheer violence that they enacted through those terror attacks that continues to inspire in Australia and across the West. The movement itself, Australia produced more foreign fighters per head of population, per capita, that is, than just about any other Western nation. We had several hundred young men go and fight, and also dozens of young women go and spend time in the so-called caliphate. What we have now is a significant issue where we've seen emerging and a coalescing around the issue of the Gaza conflict, and we've seen that play out in unique ways. So not only is there foreign interference from Iran, we know Qatari influence in Australia is significant and potentially growing. But we also know that in this context, that there is a population of second, third, and fourth generation young men who are buying into these extremist narratives about a war against Islam, the war on the West, the need to take up arms, and then that's where a significant challenge is emerging.
From what we know so far and what's in the public domain, do you think a foreign state, perhaps like Iran or Qatar, had a role to play in this? Or do you think this was, because of the father-son dynamic and the way this was planned, this is more likely to be an at-home hatched conspiracy?
Yeah, look, I would be speculating at this point because the investigation is there to be undertaken. However, we know that, again, there's flows of money coming in from overseas. We know the Iranian ambassador was expelled in disgrace, first time since the end of World War II. An ambassador has been expelled for fomenting extremist violence here in Australia. And he used local criminal gangs, or the IRGC used local criminal gangs to enact those violence, to provide a level of separation from themselves. But that was still picked up by our intelligence agencies. In the case of Qatar, we know there's significant funding, not only of universities, but other institutions. It remains to be unpacked. This is a significant issue. I think, unfortunately, it's taken this to potentially wake us up to the scale of the problem and the challenge. And I think there's going to be, unfortunately, a lot of repercussions, but also a lot of work to be done to unpack what made this occur. Is this symptomatic of a couple of lone actors, or is there a much deeper challenge?
Now, there is a lot of criticism about Prime Minister Albanese and the way he has handled this, because he's now been in power for 2 terms now. So there will be speculation about his role. Do you think perhaps he underplayed or misread the situation and failed to adapt to some of the challenges, mainly because of his perhaps political leanings, maybe because of wanting to be seen as politically correct? Do you think some of the arguments that are coming against him in that sense, they are valid, or do you think that this is the heat of the moment and it's very easy to blame the Prime Minister for what's happening?
Of course, it's always easy to blame the person in charge. I think there is some validity to this. I think for quite a prolonged period of time, there's been lip service paid to Jewish concerns, and often in the same vein as talking about other forms of racism, like Islam, like anti-Muslim racism, and so on, where anti-Semitism, according to our intelligence agencies, has been the most significant threat. And that speaks to a number of things, including the size of the Muslim voting constituency, which is significantly larger than Jewish population, but also in key marginal seats where the government needed to win those seats and to keep populations on side with themselves politically. Also speaks to the factional underpinning of the current government. The socialist left faction are in the ascendant in the Australian Parliament, or Australian government. And they historically have sided with not only pro-Palestinian issues, but more broadly, this idea of anti-colonialism and so on. And so to that extent, there's a natural resonance between the arguments being made by the left and the far left, and Islamists who also have a very similar worldview.
Do you think across the world there's been a trend where anti-Semitism has basically started to masquerade as anti-Israel sentiments, where there are people who genuinely criticized what the Israeli government is doing, but there are also people who are joining that umbrella and basically peddling their anti-Semitism? It's got nothing to do with policy or preferences and everything to do with religion. Do you think there's been a hijacking that's happened where anti-Semitism is being squeezed into anti-Israelism and it's become a giant umbrella that you can't differentiate anymore?
Yeah, look, I would incline to agree. I think the elephant in the room here is this idea of Zionism, and that obviously it has always been okay to criticise the Israeli state and the Israeli government for its actions. However, to identify Israel as some sort of rogue state that doesn't have the right to exist oversteps that barrier and steps very clearly into the realm of anti-Semitism. And then that's become conflated. So the language of post-colonialism and Edward Said's Orientalism and so on has really muddied those waters and made it acceptable to not only call for for rights for Palestinians, which is again perfectly acceptable, but to cross that line into calling for the extermination of the Israeli state. And in the world that we're occupying now, anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism. They're saying, well, we're not talking about Jews, we're talking about Zionists, where all research indicates that a significant majority of Jews are Zionists because they believe in the right of Israel to exist. And that's where it's become muddied and become particularly challenging and complex for outsiders, people who aren't really intimately engaged in the debates to understand and to unpick. And that's how we find ourselves where we are.
In that context, what do you make of Prime Minister Albanese's statement where he said, basically promised tougher gun laws, despite the fact that Australia has some of the toughest gun laws on the planet, and yet something like this happened? Do you think perhaps he failed to address the root cause of this, which wasn't essentially guns, but the ideology of the men who were carrying those guns? Do you think he perhaps shifted the scale of blame more towards guns than the ideology?
Yeah, you're hitting the nail on the head tonight. I think in this particular instance, we need to address those gun laws and actually look at are there weaknesses. But on the other hand, this is a reasonably small element of the problem. Our gun laws have proven fit for purpose for a prolonged period of time. For 30 years, we haven't had a mass casualty attack from the use of weapons. In this particular instance, you had two individuals with 6 weapons using basic tactics of overwatch and cycling through their weapons quickly to achieve maximum casualties with quite low-powered weapons. And so, the fact that an extremist could ever have access through a close acquaintance or family member to those weapons is problematic, and certainly higher levels of screening is an issue that should be addressed. But, talking about mass gun laws as potentially politically popular, particularly with his core constituency, won't address the deeper underpinning of this, which is a deeply embedded anti-Semitism in which Australia's Jews are caught between neo-Nazis on the one hand, extreme left and Islamists on the other, and many are talking about their future in Australia. And to that extent, it's not going to address any of those issues.
Finally, you just mentioned the neo-Nazi and the far-right groups in Australia. How do you see them capitalizing or weaponizing on this? Because the shooters were a migrant family. I'm sure they will be peddling conspiracy theories and agenda-driven reportage about migrants and families in Australia to drive home their point on the far right as well. Do you think this is going to muddy the waters in Australia further vis-a-vis migration and woke culture and all of those things?
Every terror attack results almost immediately in conspiracy theories about false flags and everything else. In this case, having paid some attention to what the extreme right have been saying and doing in the aftermath, I think they're a little bit confused. They don't know how to respond because on the one hand, they are calling for the eradication of Australia's Jews and their mass deportation. But on the other hand, they've got a deep hatred of Muslims as well. And so they've been remarkably quiet at the moment. However, I think they would be, if anything, as I've seen it, they've sided with pro-Palestinian movement in their hatred of Israel first and their hatred of Jews first. And in the Nazi worldview, Jews are the foremost target for that ideological orientation. So I think that's probably where it's falling, although there's more research to be done.
Right. Well, what happened over the weekend in Bondi Beach was absolutely horrible. Some 15 people killed. dozens others in the hospital over what's been described as a terror attack driven by anti-Semitism. The probe is still on. We'll wait for more answers to come out from the Australian officials. In the meantime, thank you so much, Professor, for joining us and answering some of those questions.
Thanks for your time.
They promised glory. They delivered fear. They shaped nations. They scarred generations. From brutal purges to propaganda machines, from stolen power to violent falls from the throne. Welcome to The Dictator, a series that strips away the myth and then exposes the men behind the tyranny. History remembers their power. Firstpost reveals their truth.